You're very good at this arguing stuff. I was a high school debater once upon a time.
Oh, yeah?
Brings back good memories. So
I was a college debater, so I hope you can hear it in my voice.
There you go.
The climate movement is at a crossroads. Affordability and reliability are the top concerns for Americans, and clean energy boosters haven't been able to convince everyone, yet, that they can actually deliver on those priorities. Bill McKibben is one of America's best-known environmentalists. He works as both a writer and an activist to try to reduce carbon emissions and achieve other environmental priorities. I asked him on the show to talk about his new book, Here Comes the Sun, and press him on why the environmental movement, including Bill himself sometimes, have been hesitant or oppositional to technologies like nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture and storage, and other things that could actually help achieve our carbon emissions goals. I also ask him why environmentalists have been so loath to actually engage in permitting reform talks with the Republicans, important if we're ever going to actually achieve the clean energy build-out Bill wants to achieve. We end up disagreeing a lot, which makes for a very fun conversation. My name is Demsas. I'm the founder and editor of The Argument, a magazine dedicated to revitalizing liberalism for the 21st century. On this show, we bring together everyone from conservatives to socialists to talk about the biggest issues of the day. If you're interested in seeing an ad-free episode, you can subscribe at theargumentmag.com. Bill McKibben, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, so I have been a longtime follower of your work. Before I actually became a journalist, when I was figuring out what I wanted to do in college, I was in the climate space. I worked at the Climate Action Campaign when the Clean Power Plan was in development in the Obama White House, and one of the things that I had to do was compile a bunch of reports and pieces of evidence that would be helpful for activists in state houses to push for the Clean Power Plan in key places. And it was a lot of Bill McKibben quotes, let me tell you, a lot of Bill McKibben quotes. So been a follower of your work for a long time. So I want to start, we're here in part because you have a book out that I'm excited to talk to you about. But I also want to start with situating this conversation in this moment in politics. How do you feel about the politics of climate right now in the wake of the massive climate investments that the Biden administration made, but then, of course, the disappointing results for climate-concerned voters and activists in the 2024 election?
I think this country is going to pay a very heavy price, and I think the climate will pay some price too. The good news is that the rest of the world, which represents about 89% of emissions, is now moving and quickly in a new direction. The U.S. is at best going to be the caboose on that train, at worst is trying to be the anchor on that ship. But I think that's the story of the last 9 months. I mean, when American historians look at the last 9 months, they'll be trying to figure out, how we started experimenting with this weird off-brand fascism that we're playing around with. But when world historians look at it, I think they'll look at the clean energy space and say, in these 9 months, America passed technological and with it economic primacy to the Chinese, and that probably political primacy will follow. So if we're talking climate, we're talking about the entire world. That's the useful, unit of reference, and the rest of the world is going better than we are right now.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, it's like a very depressing picture you've just painted for us, which I think will be reflected in a lot of our viewers' view of what's going on in our politics right now. I wonder, do you think that the focus, climate was perhaps in the same way that healthcare was for Obama, climate was Biden's kind of focused, largest issue when it comes to the infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, and also just in their public communications, they really talked a lot about creating a clean energy with good new jobs. Do you think that had any impact on the election, or why didn't it if it didn't?
I don't think it had much impact on the election. The last election seems to me a strange one in many ways, one of which was that the Democrats during the entire Biden years were truly terrible at messaging at all. They weren't too bad at getting stuff done. In certain ways, you can make the argument that this was a return to the days of LBJ and, a really activist government trying to do interesting things. But man, were they terrible at talking about it in any way that mattered. And so by the time we got to the election, it seemed to me that it was decided by a kind of set of random factors around the price of eggs and what people thought of Joe Biden's debate performance and so on and so forth.
When you think about climate as an issue, obviously it's the most important issue. You've dedicated your life to this. One thing that pollsters have pointed out increasingly recently is that climate seems not to rise to the level of things like cost of living, crime, immigration. Is that something you think impacts whether or not political officials or politicians should put that at the center of their politics in an election way?
Sure. So, I don't think it's an uncomplicated political question. 2020, when climate was actually a very central political issue, an important topic of the debates in the Democratic primaries, by some polls, the number one issue, seemed to work out pretty well. We didn't talk about it in 2024. That didn't work out very well. I don't think probably in either case it was the reason. I think elections are often overdetermined. But at any rate, were I a politician now, I think I'd spend less time talking about climate and more time talking about energy. The climate crisis is a crisis of fossil fuel. It comes from the fact that by burning coal and gas and oil, we put immense amounts of carbon and methane in the atmosphere, and their molecular structure traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. And eventually that shows up in large parts of our second largest city burning to the ground in January, prolonged droughts and floods across huge expanses of our country and the world, insurance industry completely unable to cope with the changes in the weather that now are driving premiums through the roof. But the real answer here is to shift off coal and gas and oil. And now we have a way to do that, and it's sun and wind and batteries. And if I were a politician right now, I would be relentlessly making the case that the Trump administration has increased demand for electricity, mostly with their allegiance to the data center project, at the same time that they've radically constricted the supply by not allowing us to build new solar or wind, indeed shutting down 80% complete wind farms off the coast of New England. You don't need to be a PhD economist, which I am not, to know that when you increase demand and constrict supply, the price is going to go up, and that really the only cure for that is to figure out how to increase the supply, which happily it would be easy to do. Every other country around the world is now dramatically doing it over these few years.
So, unfortunately in the United States, we have to consider politics also through the lens of the Electoral College, which means things like having an outsized impact on things like the views of people in who are, I think, overrepresented in our politics. They should obviously have a voice like everyone else, but they end up being overrepresented, which are, people in coal country, folks who are in, places where fossil fuels are often the underlying economic engine of their communities. So, of course, the Midwest, but also Pennsylvania. We saw in 2024 Kamala Harris, really pulling back on claims about ending fracking and things like that. Obviously, we just witnessed it did not work as a winning message. But I do think there's this question here, which I think is at the heart of the Democratic Party, and you strike at this a little bit in the book that you've written, which is Is it the case that it is politically possible to have a climate politic at the heart of a Democratic Party that is also concerned with cost, that is also trying to win in these states like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's not only possible, it's pretty easy. I've spent my life in rural America, some of it in red state, some of it in blue. I've lived on dirt roads my whole life. I have lots of neighbors who have Trump flags on the mailbox and who have solar panels on the roof. And so I know from talking with them at church, at fire company, at wherever, what that's about. They're not doing it for climate reasons. They're doing it because their home is their castle, and it's a better castle if it's got an independent power supply on it. It's really possible, indeed, I think pretty easy to talk about clean, cheap energy across what we've taken to calling the heartland of America. The states with the biggest renewable energy percentages in this country are mostly big Midwestern states with lots of wind power, where electricity prices are super cheap. In fact, 8 of the 10 states with the cheapest electricity prices are also the states with the highest renewable penetration. So this should be well within the capacity of any moderately skilled politician to talk about with ease, especially since Trump is giving them every opening. I don't know anybody who thinks that it was a good idea to, say, shut down those nearly finished wind farms off the New England coast. I don't know anybody who was pleased at the news last week that they'd unilaterally decided to stop construction on what would have been the biggest solar farm in the United States in Nevada, would have provided power, cheap power, to 2 million homes. People understand that this is good resource, and it's up now to politicians to do a good job of explaining just exactly how ridiculous in the service of their big oil overlords the Trump administration has been. Again, that shouldn't be too hard a case to make. Donald Trump literally, during the last election campaign, in a not very secret meeting with big oil executives, told them, if you give me $1 billion, I will give you anything you want. They came up with roughly $500 million when you add up donations and advertising and lobbying in the last election cycle. And clearly that was enough. I don't think there are many fans of big oil out there in this country. And I think that this is ripe electoral ground for smart politicians to be busily exploring.
So, I think there's 2 things I want to pull out there. One is this claim around big oil corruption in the Trump administration, which, I remember seeing that reporting that did happen. He said that's directly to those lobbyists. But I also just think that, ideologically, a lot of conservative people, including Trump administration, with or without that statement, they probably, or with or without donations from the big oil, I think are ideologically committed to fossil fuels in a way that we're witnessing right now. And not to say that there's no impact from lobbyists, but it's just, to me, it's I think that they believe that these are better energy sources.
Yeah, Trump clearly has a deep-seated animus, especially against wind power.
Against wind,
because he was worried that the view from the ninth fairway at his Scottish golf course would be marred by the appearance of wind turbines on the horizon. Before Trump came along, there was not a deep-seated opposition among rank-and-file Republicans to clean energy. The polling shows that this is one of the things that polls extremely well across partisan and ideological lines. But the Republican Party, as a professional operation, has been essentially purchased by the fossil fuel industry for the last quarter century. I mean, its biggest funders year after year after year were the Koch brothers and their network. And, so it's been all but impossible for Republican politicians to buck the fossil fuel industry for years and years. But as I say, it's entirely possible to argue this with rank and file Americans without trouble. Let me give you an example. In the last couple of years, across Europe, there's been this explosion of what we're calling balcony solar. This is for apartment dwellers, people who don't have a roof. So they go to Best Buy, whatever you call Best Buy in Brussels, and you come home with for a few €100, you come home with a solar panel designed to hang over the railing of your balcony. You just plug it into the wall. You don't even need an electrician. You don't need anything. And it often produces 20%, 25% of the power that an apartment might use. Well, that's illegal every place in this country, except in that progressive bastion, the state of Utah, which earlier this year, by unanimous vote of both houses of the state legislature, passed enabling legislation on the pretty unimpeachable grounds, in the words of the Republican senator who introduced the whole thing. If this is good enough for the people of Stuttgart, why can't the good people of Provo have it? And nobody had an answer. And so now there's lots of videos on YouTube of earnest Utahns putting up their balcony solar.
But I think, I totally agree with you, but I think it's important to draw a distinction between, the claims that a lot of people are open to, you should be able to put up solar panels on your own roof if you want to, or energy dynamism requires us to have a diversity of energy sources, or people don't really have like strong feelings about whether or not there is solar or versus wind somewhere in the energy mix. I think it's true that there's not like a hostility inherent in the American people towards renewables, but I do think that's different than something you said earlier, which is that we need to totally phase out fossil fuels, which I do think that in particular is quite controversial.
Yeah, well, so I don't know anyone who's actually insisting on that. I can't think of a politician who has that as their
But you think that, right?
plan. But, well, I think over time we have no choice if we're going to deal with climate change. But I also don't think it's going to be all that difficult. There'll be some sectors, especially long-haul aviation, that'll take a while. But I don't think there's anything magic about fossil fuel. Here's in some ways the most interesting case in America right now. The fastest growing use of clean energy in this country is in the state of Texas. By quite a large margin, it's taken over from California now as the growth center. Texas, as you'll recall, has been having trouble in recent years with blackouts and things. That's why Senator Cruz had to take his emergency vacation to Cancun to escape his darkened dwelling.
He has quite the timing for his vacations, huh?
Yes, very much. They don't have that trouble anymore. As the head of the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, which is what we call the grid regulator in Texas, said at the end of the summer, we got through this quite hot summer in Texas without any strain because we've got so many solar panels and so many batteries. Our system is now very stable. And that commitment was tested this year in the state legislature in Albany. The fossil fuel industry, which, as you know, has a certain amount of political standing in the Lone Star State, was not happy with the fact that they were building wind turbines and solar panels willy-nilly. And they introduced a number of pieces of legislation that people thought would pass, the most prominent of which local editorialists took to calling DEI for natural gas, because it would have forced anyone putting up 5 megawatts of solar to also put up 5 megawatts of natural gas, just to keep it from becoming sad, They expected all this to pass, but it didn't pass because out of the hinterlands, rural Texas, came lots of people to Austin to say, you know what, this is how we pay the taxes in our rural county. This is what keeps the schools open. We don't have oil in our part of Texas, but we got plenty of wind, or we've got lots of sun. Do not do this. And the Texas legislature demurred. It returned to its more important task of redistricting Texas to give Mr. Trump some more seats. And then it adjourned, and happily the Texas legislature only meets every other year. So, wind and sun will have another 18 months to consolidate their hold on Texas.
So I want to get to your book, because I think that while you have a very doomer outlook on the American political state right now. You have a very optimistic read in your book. So tell us about like why are you so optimistic about the future of climate change?
Well, I'm not super optimistic about the future of climate change. We have waited too long to stop global warming. That's no longer on the menu. We're already seeing immense amounts of damage, and we're going to see a lot more damage. Look, I wrote the first book about all of this back in the unbelievably distant past, back in the 1980s, okay? And the predictions that we were making then about what was going to happen have now come true. I mean, we're seeing them around the world every day, some of them very dramatic. Look, the second largest city in this nation, large sections of it burnt to the ground in a week 9 months ago. We've forgotten now because so much has happened since, but that was a pretty big deal and indicative of the kind of thing that happens every day someplace around the world. More fundamentally, deep, important physical systems of the planet are now beginning to wobble. The jet stream, which draws its power from the temperature difference between the equator and the poles. As the poles warm, the jet stream gets stuck in weird high amplitude positions. And the weather is very funky as a result. The Gulf Stream, the series of enormous currents, 100 times the flow of the Amazon River, that distribute heat through the Atlantic. They're beginning to flicker and falter as fresh water pours off Greenland and a melting Arctic and changes the salinity and density of the Atlantic that runs those conveyor belts. So we're damaging the deepest systems on Earth, and that's very, very scary, and it's happening in very real time. But finally, for the first time in the 30-some years that I've been working on this, we actually have a scalable tool with which to begin to take this on. Look, the story of climate policy for most of those 35 years was fossil fuel is cheap and renewable energy is expensive. The same thing that's destroying the planet is undergirding the planet's economy. That obviously makes progress hard. We spent a lot of time necessarily trying to basically increase the price of fossil fuel, carbon taxes, divestment to drive up their cost of capital, stopping infrastructure expansion to keep them from consolidating their hold on parts of the world, on and on and on. About 5 years ago, we passed some invisible line where the cost of generating power from the sun and the wind was suddenly lower than the cost of burning coal and gas and oil. We live now, Jerusalem, on a planet where the cheapest way to make energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That's a potentially epochal moment for human civilization. Look, for at least 700,000 years or so, the anthropologists tell us, human beings have made their living by setting stuff on fire. Mostly it pretty much worked. We learned to cook food. That gave us the big brain. We were able to move north and south from the equator. No one was living up where I live in the mountains of the Northeast before fire. The anthropologists even think that standing around the campfire every night for eons started building the social bonds that mark our species. It was a kind of proto-Zoom.
So we got to get back to those fires, huh?
Yeah. When we learned to control the combustion of oil and gas and coal, that was the Industrial Revolution, and it produced modernity. So on balance, not bad. But now the cost is unbearably high. We're breaking down the planet's climate system. 9 million people a year, maybe 1 death in 5 is attributable to breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. There are 5 million school children in New Delhi. 2.5 million have irreversible lung damage from breathing the air. And, not a small thing, we have to fight an endless series of wars and skirmishes around the world to protect the lines of supply to the concentrations of fossil fuel scattered and rare on which the Earth depends. So the fact that right at this moment, as our climate falls apart, we suddenly are able to take advantage of the fact that the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky, whose rays we can catch on photovoltaic panels, whose heat, which heats the earth differentially, creating the winds that turn those majestic turbines. That's a very, very good thing. And with that crossing that invisible line of price, we've suddenly seen this rocket-like surge in the use of this stuff. It took from 1954 to 2022 to get our first terawatt of solar power installed around the world. It took 2 years to get the second terawatt by 2024. The third will be sometime in the course of this fall. The world is getting a third more energy from the sun this autumn than we did last autumn. This is the fastest growing source of energy supply we've ever seen on the planet. And hopefully, if we can push hard, we can make it come fast enough to begin, not to catch up to the physics of global warming. It's too late for that. But at least to start shaving tenths of a degree off how hot the planet eventually gets. And that really matters because, as best we can tell, every tenth of a degree Celsius that we raise the temperature moves 100 million of our brothers and sisters from a safe climate zone to a dangerous one. So this remains the most important work humans could be engaged in.
So the book's thesis really is that because of the drop in price for the cost of solar energy, and also wind and batteries, that you could imagine a future where not just the American, but the world's electricity needs are completely covered by those three sources. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I think there'll be some other things along the way. I think we're going to get eventually pretty good at geothermal power. I think nuclear power may come down in price enough to be a legit part of all of this. But I think that sun and wind and batteries are the big tools we have for the short order task of really changing our energy system. And it has to be a short order task. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us a couple of years ago that if we had any hope of staying on anything like the path we set out in Paris a decade ago, that we'd need to cut emissions in half by the end of this decade, which by now is 4 years and 3 months away. The heavy lifting for that's going to have to be done by sun, wind, and batteries. But the good news is that it's not completely impossible to imagine change on that scale. In May, the Chinese were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a coal-fired power plant. So they were putting up one of those every 8 hours out of solar panels. Mm-hmm. That kind of shift is remarkable. We don't see it quite as much here because, thanks to the Trump administration, we're not doing it on that scale, though we could be. I mean, just last week, as I say, we shut off a plan for a 6 gigawatt solar farm in Nevada that would have supplied power to 2 million homes. There's only 140 million homes in America. So that one 6 gigawatt power plant in Nevada would have provided enough for 1.5% of all the households in this country.
But this is this is one of those things.
We could be doing this too.
Yeah, this is at this point. I think there's like the major critique of folks who have been very bullish on solar comes in, which is that solar, as you know, is not like other more consistent forms of energy production, in that usually it only produces energy at around 25% of the time, right? Roughly on average, of its capacity. And so the capacity could be, like you said, 1 million homes, but those homes can only rely on it 1/4 of the time. So you end up in a situation
those
where
2 million homes, that would be enough power when they
putting aside that, putting aside that
would
example
be enough,
in particular.
as much power. But yes.
But I think the problem that ends up being that, solar energy, you have to build like 4 times as much as you might otherwise
The knock
need.
on it has been that it's intermittent, so that you need to overbuild more. And that's true. You do need to build a lot of it. Happily, batteries are helping us a lot here. Batteries, have come down in price at roughly the same rate that solar panels have, which is to say astronomically. We're figuring out new ways to store energy all the time, and we're finding that the things we worried about, like would we run out of lithium, turn out not to be big problems. The price of lithium has dropped even as we've built infinitely more batteries than we ever have before, just because once we started looking, we found out that there was lots of it. So the main, I think at this point in this country, the main obstacles to the scaling of renewable energy are the political ones. We've built a political system that's easy to game, and the fossil fuel industry has the cash flow to game it, and they have been doing it. So now we have essentially energy executives in charge of every important agency dealing with this stuff in the U.S. government, and all they're doing is protecting the business model of their old industry.
But I want to push on this, though, because I think if solar and these other forms of renewable energy are so inevitable, then why do we still need subsidies for these industries?
Well, look, we don't have subsidies for them. Instead, we're busily under the new, under the big, beautiful bill, we've instead reinstated subsidies for coal.
But there's also state subsidies, like California, for instance.
Say again?
Like there's state subsidies, for instance.
Yeah, there's certainly state subsidies. We need them because we need to make this transition for lots of reasons, and we need to make it fast for climate reasons. If we had all the time in the world, i.e. if climate was not an issue, then it wouldn't make much difference. 30 years from now, we're going to run the planet on sun and wind based on economics alone. But if it takes us 30 years to get there, then the planet we run on sun and wind is going to be a broken planet. That's the point about the Gulf Stream and the jet stream. And this is not this is pretty mandatory. Physics doesn't negotiate very well. It's starting to do all the things that, physicists said it was going to do. And the response of our government has been so far this year to shut down the instruments that let us know how much carbon is assembling in the atmosphere, that let us look at the storms as they gather in the ocean, so on and so forth. They're taking roughly the position of my 18-month-old grandson, who believes that if you cover your eyes, no one can any longer see you. We're not behaving like policy-making adults at the moment.
So one of the things that you just said, like you think in 30 years it's possible running largely on solar, sun, and wind. And, I think I'm a little bit more skeptical about our capacity to be able to do that without any fossil fuels, without geothermal and nuclear or hydropower, significant hydropower. For instance, I don't think
we're definitely going to have lots of hydropower. We're going to have as much hydropower as we have now.
But in your book, you say that we think we should reduce the number of hydropower we have.
I don't think we'll substantially reduce it, and I imagine that we'll actually increase the amount of power we're getting from hydropower, because what we're doing now is when you recondition the powerhouses now of big hydro dams, we're able to get more power out of them. The biggest problem for hydropower, Jerusalem, is going to be that increasingly we've got drought in places that depend on hydropower. And that's becoming a big problem. So, you've probably visited Hoover Dam in recent years. There's not much water left behind it. It's lucky for Nevada that they're in a desert, so they can produce an awful lot of solar power to compensate for the water that's evaporating out of that Colorado system.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, one of the things that I was struck by in your book is there's a lot of techno-optimism in it, like when you point out the remarkable speed with which we've been able to turn photovoltaic technology into actionable electricity that is powering a lot of people's lives right now. But I think it's also, in some cases, I'm hoping you can help me understand the distinction when you feel a little bit more skeptical about technology. And I think it comes in a few places. It seems like you're maybe slightly more open to geothermal and hydro than I'd read you in the book. But I think that on carbon capture and storage technology, I correctly read you as being very, very skeptical. And now I want to steelman the case for CCS, and then I want to hear why you think it's a problem. So, I went to Iceland and I saw the Mammoth plant, and it's like, I don't know if you've ever been to see that, but it is like a remarkable thing to witness.
It's mammoth.
It's mammoth. I mean, it's huge, but it's also, I mean, Iceland also is just beautiful, so anything you put there is going to really shock you. And then, of course, you start asking questions, as many journalists have, around how much carbon are you really sucking out of the air, particularly when we think relative to how much carbon it took to build this plant and to operate the plant. Now, the plant runs on geothermal, so which is great. So there's no big concern there. But people have pointed out that it's very small, the amount to which carbon capture storage has been able to pull out of the atmosphere. But at the same time, right, like, people could have levied those critiques against solar decades ago. People could have levied those critiques against wind. People do to this day say, like, citing false statistics about how it takes more carbon to build the turbines than it does than it actually benefits. And so I think the thing I would say is that this is a nascent technology. The Clean Air Task Force has pointed out that 75% of emissions reductions are expected to come from technology that is not yet mature. So why aren't you excited to kind of invest in this technology?
Look, I'm hopeful someone can figure out how to make it work. It's a hard problem. And the reason it's a hard problem is physics. So, as you know, greenhouse gases, carbon, is in the atmosphere as of today at about 423 parts per million, which is more than enough to raise the temperature of the planet dramatically.
But it's very diffuse,
But it's very diffuse. So the amount of energy that it takes to go suck it, to go find that 423 parts in each million parts of air, separate it out, sequester it, is at this point really intense. Now, maybe it'll get better, and that's great, but that doesn't have anything to do with the need for clean energy generation technology. These are two different ends of the problem. You walk into your bathroom, and the tub is dramatically overflowing. So you have several things that you need to do. The first one is, for most people, turn off the tap, okay? Which means, in this case, shut down coal and oil and gas. And the only way in a modern world that we can do that, because I do not think that we're going to dramatically change our desires for energy in a short order. The only way you can do that is by substituting something else, and the only affordable things are sun and wind and batteries at the moment at that scale. Once you've turned off the tap, then it's a good idea to investigate whether or not you can enlarge the drain at the bottom of the tub in order to make the thing drain faster. It would be a bad idea, I think, to go into the bathroom and say, well, let's go to work on this drain here, see if we can get something done about it. And in the meantime, let's just let the tap run as fast as it can. Maybe we'll catch up someday. Job one is to figure out how we turn off the coal and oil.
But this metaphor, I take issue with, because, I mean, it's in tension with what you even said at the beginning of this episode, which is it's not just waste. Like, energy is life, it's modernity. I mean, we think about particularly developing nations, right? So it's not just a question of, turn off the tap on this wasteful, harmful problem. It is, hey, there's this thing which is providing literal development, like people moving out of poverty, moving into just having air conditioning, saving lives. And a byproduct of it is, of course, everything you've laid out here, which I'm sure our listeners are well aware of. But I think then the question becomes, how do you cause the least amount of damage to particularly people who are trying to develop their lives?
So I think that the answer to that is that this is the place where clean energy is the most obvious winner. Look, in a country like ours that has a huge amount of energy infrastructure already built and whatever, it's going to take a while to figure out how to switch it over. Not as long as, I mean, we could do it pretty quickly if we were just operating logically, but we're not, and there's political obstacles and infrastructure obstacles in the way. But let's go. I've spent a lot of time in across much of Africa. So these are places that fossil fuel literally did nothing for. There's 650 or 700 million people in Africa with no electricity. Coal, been around for 250 years, has signally failed to get the job done. The UN says that almost all those people are going to get their first energy from renewable energy, mostly
Wait,
sun.
what do you mean coal failed? What is that? What do you mean by that?
Well, no one ever built the grid.
Yes.
They never will.
Okay.
So you have just
So we
endless
failed though,
amounts
right?
of
Like
rural Africa. Yeah, but we failed because this technology was not suited for doing it. You couldn't figure out how to make it economically work across Africa to do it. But you can figure out how to make solar work economically, and in fact, that's what's happening this year. Big new report in August from the big think tank Ember showing a 60% increase in 1 year in the import of solar panels across Africa. The unit of deployment is going to be the village scale microgrid. Literally with a container load's worth of batteries and solar panels and some fairly rudimentary wiring, you can take a community and put it online in the course of a few days. And to watch that happen, by the way, is extraordinarily moving. At the country level, when we talk about, remember, 80% of the world lives in countries that are net importers of fossil fuel, okay? Which presents a big economic problem for those countries. When we talk about balance of payments crises, countries in debt crisis, countries that the IMF goes in and structurally adjusts so that they have to stop spending on schools and whatever, the biggest part of that problem in many, if not most cases, is the need to pay for the next shipload of oil that's swinging at anchor out in the harbor, in order to keep the economy some way or another afloat. That never stops. Even big countries face this problem. India, biggest country in the world now, spends 5% of its GDP importing fossil fuel. That's a lot, okay? And they've figured it out, which is why India this summer hit its 2030 solar target 5 years ahead of schedule. That's why Indonesia earlier this summer announced that they were going to build 100 gigs of solar by 2030. The Trump administration is desperately trying to use tariffs to coerce these guys into buying liquefied natural gas from the Gulf of Mexico. You get your tariffs cut down if you agree. And so some of them are agreeing in the short term, but any responsible country, I think, is looking at that and saying, why would I depend for my source of energy on a country as erratic and unstable as the United States, when instead I could buy myself a bunch of solar panels and depend on no country? I just have to depend on the sun, which so far has risen every day. That's the shift that's happening here. And it's, I think, going to be of great benefit to the poorest countries in the world. Now, we could and should speed up that process. We could and should be giving lots of aid to make this happen faster. We should be doing it, A, because we have a moral debt, having gotten rich by filling the atmosphere with carbon ourselves, carbon which is now exacting a greater toll on poor countries than rich ones. And we should do it out of self-interest because carbon everywhere is a threat to us as well. But as you know, our country is not going to do that anytime soon. And so we will, I think we're going to depend on the Chinese mercantile system working pretty well. There are places where that's happening. I write in the book about what happened in Pakistan over the last couple of years. Pakistan, horribly hit by climate change. The two worst floods since Noah in 2010 and 2022. The temperatures in its urban centers now often reach 120 degrees or more in the summer, at the edge of survival. But their geographic advantage is a long border with China, across which have come huge numbers of cheap solar panels over the last couple of years. And they're making good use of them. Maybe the most dramatic use has been in the agriculture sector. You've probably traveled in rural Asia, so you know that when you do, if you go quickly, you'll hear what used to be anyway, the soundtrack of rural Asia was the hum and often cough of diesel generators running the pumps that pull water up out of these deep tube wells for irrigation. These are kind of the legacy of the Green Revolution of the 1960s. Diesel's often the biggest input cost for farmers in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. So Pakistani farmers were big early adopters. They often lacked the money to build the metal stanchions that we're used to seeing that put solar panels up at an angle to the sun. They just laid them on the ground, pointed them up. Pakistani farmers used 35% less diesel last year than they had the year before. That's a big, life-altering kind of change. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, what we're going to be seeing more and more around the world.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the growth in renewables, we're also seeing in sub-Saharan Africa growth in coal production as well, is financed sometimes by Chinese companies. So I think that's also a reflection of the fact that they need energy faster than can be satisfied by renewals. And I think that the question I have for you about that though
what's so interesting.
What I want to ask you about this in particular is that it's not just a question of, obviously ideally it would be helpful to give as much renewable energy support as possible to developing nations so that they can catch up to all the advancements of modern day society in the West without having to sacrifice on the climate front. But given that that's extremely unlikely, is it your position that they should not be building out coal or fossil fuels?
I don't think they're going to build out coal. So Pakistan's instructive
right now
here
they
too.
are, right?
So Pakistan built a lot of coal-fired power plants in the latter part of the last decade with Chinese money. Mm-hmm. They're now, that power's no longer needed. They're producing, the demand for power on the electric grid has been dropping and pretty substantially in Pakistan because people have put up so many solar panels. In fact, Pakistan had to this year beg Qatar to postpone shipments of LNG to their power plants because they don't need them and don't want to have to pay for them. So they're trying to get out of those contracts. Mm-hmm. The Chinese are systematically undercutting their own loan making for coal, which they're not doing anymore. They've stopped doing this in the rest of the world with their now quick provision of clean energy. And it's not just for the Chinese, the energy itself. The solar panels, I think, are going to turn out to be kind of the lost leader here in this thing. It's all the stuff that goes with a steady supply of clean energy. So, for instance, if you're buying a car in most of the developing world right now, you're probably not shopping for something that its lineage comes from Detroit. The last couple of years, 2 or 3 cities in China have replaced Detroit as the centers of automotive excellence on this planet. They're producing very good cars for 10 grand and unbelievable ones for 30 grand. And so, not surprisingly, people in a position to buy a car in the developing world are turning to them. Even more important, I think, is the advent of the e-bike, which I think you've written a little bit about recently.
I love my e-bike.
I think it may turn out to be the single most interesting piece of technology around the world that comes out of all of this. Look, the bicycle was a pretty good piece of technology to begin with, okay? And now we have invented a bicycle that has no hills. That is a profound shift and will be for billions of people, women, children, men across the world, who are going to have that as their main possibility for mobility. It costs a penny to go 5 miles on an e-bike, most, electric rates and things around the world. We have them here and they're plugged into the solar panels on our roof. The sun is pushing us up the hill. I mean, this is a different world.
So I want to ask about the opposition to energy development in the United States, because this is a place that you and I are actually really, really in alignment on, around the opposition to NIMBYism. And one thing that I became, when I first started reporting on this, was really shocking to me, was just how much environmental groups had been at the forefront of NIMBYism in the United States. And now, obviously, not all NIMBYs are environmentalists, but environmental groups, particularly things like the Sierra Club and different chapters, obviously not all of them are the same, but chapters of the Sierra Club or different, even national environmental organizations, while they had been opposed to pipelines and to fossil fuel projects, had also found themselves on the opposite side of not just nuclear, but solar, wind, the very types of technology you're saying we need. So why do you think that is, and do you think that that's changing?
Yeah, I think it's changing and fast, but we need to keep making it change. I think it's because because environmentalism grew up in part with people trying to protect the places that they loved or lived. And I think that that's a noble thing. And when we're protecting them from bad stuff, then I have no problem at all with NIMBYism. I think
it's not NIMBYism, right? You just think it should be no in everyone's backyard if it's bad.
Well, I mean, no, look, I mean, my friends and allies in the Gulf Coast who are fighting new LNG terminals and things, I think are some of the bravest and noblest people I know. And their, kids are having to breathe the stuff that comes out of these, and they have to deal with the loss of the fishing grounds they've relied. I mean, whatever. The lesson, the point that we have to get across to people who are opposing clean energy on environmental grounds is A, the environmental threat is usually not very large from these things, but B, the environmental threat from climate change is so overwhelming that it's folly to oppose them. I lived much of my life in upstate New York. 20 years ago, people proposed a set of wind turbines on the mountains near my house. They were on the edge of a wilderness area that I probably know as well as almost anybody in the world. I've traversed it at every season, and I love it. And I understood why people didn't want to look at huge wind turbines on the edge of it, okay? In the best of all possible worlds, I guess we wouldn't, but we don't live in anything close to the best of all possible worlds. And I understood that the threat to that place came far more from the fact that if we don't get climate change under control, there won't be winter there anymore. And absent winter, the suite of species with which we share this place will disappear. And so I, 20-some years ago, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times saying, build this thing above my house. Now, I did lose some environmentalist friends over this, but not so many. Even then, most people were like, yeah, I get it. I understand why we need to do this. And I think that number keeps growing. I'm doing my best to make it so. One of the mission fields that I have taken on is to convince my tribe of highly educated old white people to stop suing to block things that they don't want to look at, because we're generally the ones who are most capable of slowing these things down, And so, we'll continue at it. That was one of the reasons we did this Sunday thing last month. We had 500 demonstrations, rallies across the country, all designed to drive home the point that we can move fast here, and that it will be beautiful to do it on balance. And I think that beautiful part is to be taken seriously. Though we need to make this shift for very practical reasons around climate, and though we're able to make it from the utilitarian economic arguments about price, there also is a part of the human brain and heart that responds to more visceral arguments. The sun is the most charismatic object in our universe. Every human being grins when the sun comes out from behind a cloud and hits them on the shoulder blades. And so the prospect of energy from heaven, not from hell, is a appealing one in all ways. I was just in Rome week before last with the new Pope for the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, Pope Francis's remarkable encyclical on climate change and the poor. And it was really moving to hear the new American Pope, Leo, echoing those same words and talking about the beauty of this transition. I'm not a pope. I'm not
You're the
even
climate
a theologian,
pope.
but I am a Sunday school teacher from
Yeah.
time to time. And so I quite like the idea that the cure for our dysfunctional relationship with the sun, which is one way of describing climate change, is a deepening of that relationship, so that we depend on this large ball of burning gas that the good Lord was kind enough to hang up there.
So I would love for you to persuade me on this, because I think that NIMBYism has led me in a different direction than you are, like appreciating the deeply held beliefs. Because I think, like you, I recognize that a lot of people have very strong views about not just what their local community should look like, but very, very concerned about new development in general for a bunch of different ideological reasons that are very, very difficult to pull them out of, because I think they have really strongly held views and they've had them for decades. So as a result of seeing all of this NIMBYism, my orientation towards climate change has really turned towards how do we get as many carbon neutral technologies built that are really low land intensity. Like, how do we really max out on nuclear, on geothermal, on batteries, and really try to decarbonize through like new technologies, for instance, like, heat batteries that are being created for the use in industrial plants and things like that. And to really, particularly as I'm watching the Trump administration really turn against wind, I really view that as a big part of the NIMBY problem, which is that people see wind. Like, Trump looks at windmills. Those are really visually arresting. And if people don't like them, I don't think I'm going to fully convince them through art that like they should like them. I think that's an aesthetic judgment that we don't have time to really override.
Well,
and so as a result of all this, I think and I think the last point on this is just around transmission, which I think is the biggest problem for solar right now, because as you know, solar needs to be located in very sunny places in order to maximize the benefit of getting those solar panels out. Like, yes, you can put them in less sunny places, but it's less valuable and you get less energy out of that. And so you need transmission lines to get that power all the way to someone who lives in a not sunny area. Same thing with wind. Wind in particular really needs to be located in windy areas, or you lose tons of the value of building those turbines at all. And so to me, I'm looking around even in the Biden administration, when they were really trying to push for things to get built. I'm looking around under the Trump administration. I'm looking around in blue states and in red states. Even in very pro-development places, transmission is very hard to build, and it's very hard to do it at the scale that you're talking about, such that in 30 or 40 years, we're running on solar and wind. So to me, I think what I am interested in is how your understanding of NIMBYism in opposition to this doesn't kind of lead you to write a book that's not Here Comes the Sun, it's Here Comes the Geothermal Nuclear Plant,
Well, I don't think that they're coming in time to do anything about, at scale, the climate crisis. We've invested huge amounts of money in nuclear, and we're putting it up at less than 1% of the rate that we're putting up sun and wind. So around the world, this is really working. It's possible that the United States is so politically immature that we can't make it work here, but I have not given up on that. I think that I think that the polling data continues to show that actually renewable energy, solar energy, wind energy are very popular and popular across ideological lines. And I think when you get out into rural America, which again is where I've spent my life, you find a lot of interesting things. One is that farmers who control most of the land that we're going to use for this are often very intrigued by the possibilities. It provides an alternative income stream and an often handsome one that doesn't go up or down the way that agriculture tends to. And I think that increasingly people understand the attractions of that. And that the more we talk about it, the more they understand it. I'll give you an example. Here's something that whenever I tell people, they kind of shake their heads and say, "Oh, I didn't know that." We use a lot of our landscape now for energy in this country. Corn is our biggest crop, 60 million acres. 30 million acres of that are used to grow corn for ethanol. That 30 million acres of our landscape produces about 3% of our energy in this country. If you covered that same 30 million acres with solar panels, by the way, you produce closer to 100% of the energy that we use. We don't want to do that. Indiana doesn't need to be covered stem to stern in solar panels, but it does help people understand the difference. So I was in an Illinois farm summer before last that I write about in the book. And I'm there with a farmer who's converting some of this land to solar panels. Here's an acre. It's in corn, gets used for ethanol. It produces enough ethanol every year to drive my Ford F-150, most popular vehicle in America for 45 years, drive it 25,000 miles. Here's another acre that I'm converting to solar panels. When it's done, it'll produce enough electrons every year to drive my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the same truck, not 25,000 miles, but about 700,000 miles. And I don't have to pour any nitrogen or phosphorus on it to make it work, nitrogen and phosphorus that then wash down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, where they create this vast dead zone. I don't have to strafe them with herbicides and pesticides. In fact, I'm left with half my field, the rows in between the solar panels, to do something else with. And that something else is the brand new, but quite beautiful, human field of what we're calling clumsily agrivoltaics, the art of growing something in between solar panels. On an overheating world, the shade that solar farms produce is not as valuable as the electrons it produces, but not invaluable, not unvaluable. It has real meaning. We're finding crop after crop that does better in those conditions. The Chinese are finding that in their deserts, the extra moisture retained under those solar panels is allowing for the first time them to actually stop or at least slow down the spread of deserts across China. They're serving a very dual purpose there. So there's a lot of, this change is so big, so potentially enormous, that there are a lot of cross-cutting things that happen with it. Don't give up too soon on the possibilities of humans to come up with creative ways to deal with things.
But I don't even
and
think it's
about them.
really giving up. I think it's more just, I think that I think I have a sense that there are a lot of people out there who simply disagree with me about the risks that they themselves face regarding climate change, or they feel that while there are those risks, that they're not willing to give up certain things about their local viewshed. They're not willing to give up certain things around the reliability, that they don't believe in solar as a reliable producer. And we can, talk about why that is. But I think once you start accepting, I think that there's a lot of people in a democracy that just simply disagree with you. I try to find solutions that are going to satisfy us, like nuclear, geothermal. These things are more satisfying.
This is why I try to write books so that we actually change how people think about things.
Yeah,
it's possible that books don't actually work very well, but
hopefully,
we do what we can.
Well, I want to ask you about permitting reform, because I think this is a place where a lot of these big ideas that we are talking about really come into contact with the political realities of the United States. So we saw under the the Biden administration, but also now there's some ongoing talks right now about making it easier to permit renewable energy, but also and transmission, as well as also fossil fuel technology as well, because of course this is a Republican-led House and Senate and presidency. It doesn't look like there's a way to get a deal done that doesn't include some fossil fuel capacity generation as well. It became clear to me and to a lot of people who care about climate at the end of the Biden administration that the deal that was being presented on permitting reform at the federal level was like a really good deal for climate. That yes, there was going to be some benefits to fossil fuel production, but the overwhelming benefits were going to accrue to transmission lines and to a lot of things that were in the queue that were solar, wind, batteries, etc. But the Democratic Party and a lot of people, not everyone, but many people in the Democratic Party and many environmental groups were either behind the scenes very opposed or vocally very opposed to this permitting deal. What is your position on how Democrats should negotiate today on this issue and whether environmental groups should stand down?
You tell me. I don't understand how negotiation works now in Washington. So say that you had some permitting reform that said we're going to allow everything, oil and gas and sun and wind and whatever, and you passed it through Congress. It feels to me as if the Trump administration would figure out some other reason to stop all the sun and wind stuff, and allow all oil and gas stuff to go forward. I don't see that there's a legitimate negotiating partner here. I don't understand
I think
how
the question
federal policy now works.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things, right? There's one, which is Trump, I don't believe will not be president forever. There will be another presidential election. And
right,
I think
clearly the whole Republican Party now is just...
I believe it's possible for a
Democrat. We do what we want.
Yeah.
We do what we want as long as we're in power. So to me, I don't really understand the negotiation. I mean, he's shutting down wind farms that had every permit that they ever could have been required to have. Mm-hmm. He's shutting down solar farms for no reason.
I mean, there's no way to prevent
there's
no way to prevent ever a president or an executive branch from finding a legitimate reason for killing a permit. The question is, there is no way to build out the kind of energy you're talking about without permitting reform. There's no way. It doesn't happen.
I just don't see that there's a negotiation to be had now. But if the situation changes, then well worth revisiting to find out. But I think the imperative at the moment is to figure out how to get these guys out of there.
But it seems like you're very concerned about timing, right? Like you're talking in this book about
I'm very concerned about timing. But that's the point. I mean, given the political reality we live in now, there's no one to negotiate with. There's no negotiation. These guys, I mean, literally, Jerusalem, the Congress goes and appropriates money for particular tasks, and then the Trump administration refuses to spend it and just spends it on something else that they want. And the Supreme Court so far has been willing to let them get away with it. So I don't
let's put aside the federal question then, because
works.
I think that maybe we disagree on the potential for change there. But at the state level then, there's a lot of these permitting conversations happening at the state level, even in just fully democratically controlled states. And in those places, you see environmental groups not wholly excited to pass permitting reform, but very opposed to the idea that you could give up power to sue, to block things, even if those things are solar, wind,
as
etc.
I say, I've written a number of times saying I think we should stop suing to block things that are useful for the environment. Mm-hmm. And I completely believe that, and I will keep saying it over and over again. But I
guess my question is why? Why do they
the
continue?
The federal permitting
you know?
stuff here is the key.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's, I think you're nobly attempting to imagine a federal government that at the moment at least doesn't exist.
Well, I think you're correct that if a federal permitting reform bill passed, that the Trump administration would continue to block permits or stop things from solar and wind that they didn't want to see built, especially on federal lands. But I think the question is just, it is very, very hard.
I think they just use it to build pipelines and to block.
Certainly, they would, but they're going to do that anyway. The question is, should you be able to also get renewables one day when there's a more amenable person?
In that case, there's no point to the whole thing. But
like in the future,
but whatever.
Like
I don't think I don't even think we're in disagreement here. Except I just, maybe it's just I'm an old cynic and you're a young idealist about our system. But at the moment,
the thing for me is
we're talking about a country where the president of the United States put out a video over the weekend of him defecating on Americans.
Yeah.
The idea that we're going to have a kind of rational, good faith negotiation with him and with Mike Johnson about, energy policy just seems whatever. I've got better things to work on than that.
Well,
I'd rather go work on balcony solar. And, getting done what
the only
I can.
thing that I will say is this: is just that I don't think it requires believing in good faith to say that if we think permitting reform needs to happen to build renewable energy, you should try to make it happen whenever you can.
I think we should try to make it happen, but not with these guys, because they'll use it to ram through bad things and then they'll just block good things. And we can't, building more fossil fuel infrastructure at this point is not a good idea. Mm-hmm. It gets us deeper in the hole that we've already dug. Mm-hmm. But, as I say, I think that one's an entirely moot point. Wish that it were not so. I'd much rather be having that debate in a working government that did something. But for the moment, at least, that's fantasy land. We're working very hard to change that third act, which, I started a couple of years ago. We've now got 100,000 old people like me hard at work. If you are out at the No Kings demonstrations, you noticed that there were a lot of people with hairlines like mine out there doing our best. We'd very much like to have a logical government again. Mm-hmm. We remember the days before presidents were flying jets, dumping human waste on the heads of their opponents, and we kind of liked those days.
So I wanted to ask you about a project from your past, which is the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant, which closed many years back. And I believe I don't know if you opposed it, but you didn't advocate for it to remain open. And I guess I wonder, do you regret that, or do you think that the anti-nuclear stance of
I've written since that I wish that it had stayed open. Mm-hmm. At the time that it went down, and this was a disappointment for me and my neighbors in Vermont, because when it went down, people said, we don't need it because we can replace it with energy from the sun and the wind. Mm-hmm. Vermont has perfectly good wind resource. But then NIMBY people in Vermont managed to impose a de facto moratorium on wind power in this state. I don't think we should. I don't think we should build another one because I don't think we have the money to do it. At the moment anyway, nuclear power is really expensive, and the same amount of money produces a lot more kilowatt hours of sun and wind. But I do think that when people have operating nuclear power plants, the risk from them is considerably less than the risk from the planet that we're dramatically overheating right now. And I think that a good assessment of risk leads you in that direction. And I'm perfectly willing to hope that somebody comes up with a small modular reactor that helps with this and that operates at something like a reasonable price. I think it's going to be hard because the price of solar power goes down by 20% every time we double the amount that we install. So far, that has not happened anything like that with nuclear power, and so it's losing to a moving target. But maybe that'll change. Maybe some good new invention will help. In the meantime, the largest nuclear reactor that we know is up there in the sky, pumping out energy all the time, and we're just letting most of it go to waste. So I'd as soon not do that.
Well, Bill, always our last and final question. What is an argument, a take, a piece of advice, something that you've heard recently that you really ticked you off?
That really ticked me off?
Yeah, something that you want to argue against. Sometimes people point to parenting advice that they've received or life advice that they've received, or they've read a tweet or a op-ed or heard a podcast where they just really disagreed with the premise. And feel free to take a minute. Sometimes people take a minute.
As you can tell, I'm consumed by the fact that we now live in a country governed by a person who deserves no respect, and who every day makes arguments crazier than the one before for whatever he's talking about. And I take that with immense seriousness. I've lived through, 13, 14 presidents. Some of them I've liked, some of them I haven't, but none of them have I felt, disgusted by. The argument that, right along these lines, that he's continually made, that renewable energy is the most expensive power in the world, is precisely the one that I've been trying to knock down. We've been calling this stuff alternative energy for 40 years, but it's not. 90% of the new generation around the world last year came from sun and wind and batteries because it's the cheapest form. It's not the Whole Foods of energy anymore, nice but pricey. It's the Costco of energy, affordable, available in bulk, on the shelf, ready to go. So that may be the least obnoxious of Donald Trump's arguments, but the stuff we're talking about today, it's the most dangerous and the most wrong. I wish I had a cleverer take, but truthfully, I think maybe the moment for cleverness is kind of past. We might as well just state very clearly the parameters of the trouble that we're in. And those include the fact that we're governed by a gross pig. And it would be good to try and change that.
Bill, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure to talk to you.
The Arguments production team includes Ranjani Chakraborty, Isabella Pereira, Angela Tracy, Kate Crawford, and Eli Richmond. Our theme music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. If you want to hear more from The Argument, you can become a subscriber at theargumentmag.com.